I noticed John thoughtfully provided me with safety glasses. So if a tomato comes my way, I've got something to hide behind. Let's go on to the next slide. Let me give you a few caveats. First, I am not an historian. One of the few people, probably the only person in this room that was actually here on Apollo at one point, in Apollo 17 as an undergraduate, at the age of some of you guys that worked on the moon rocks in Apollo 17. So I actually was here, so I can prove at some level that at least real people were here at the time. What I want to do, I can't give you a full history. That's like, History of the World Part 1. So I'm going to give you perhaps a somewhat focused view of what Apollo was about, so you can get some idea of what we did, how we did it, and then at the end of the slide, end of the talk, I have a whole list of sources, some of which are my copies are sitting in front of you here, that you can go out and try and find if you want to look into more detail on the subject. This presentation is intended to be information dense. There is lots of information on these slides. I don't expect you to read them now, and I promise, with few exceptions, I won't just read them to you. But I want you to get the information so you can go back to this a month or 6 months from now and get something out of it. So I also have a lot of pictures that I've thrown in so you can watch the pictures. And I've tried to put wherever that down to the bottom where these things are. This happens to be Al Shepard on the second EVA and Apollo 14. Next slide. If you have not memorized this quote, you should do this, okay? If this quote was never said, this room would not be here, this center probably would not be here, and we probably would not have done this. But it was said, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Another point that nobody usually hears is no single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind, more important for long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. That has proven to be true. As I'll talk a little bit later, we're still living off the investment that was made in that program. Now, there's another part of the speech. This was, by the way, not the State of the Union speech. A lot of people say, oh, he said it in the State. No, it was not. He had a message to Congress on urgent national priorities, and we were actually the fourth of 4 urgent national priorities. The rest were defense, but at least it showed up there. Next slide. This is what happened a paragraph later, and this is another thing that people always don't remember. He basically says, if we are going to decide halfway through not to do this after we've spent half the money, let's not do it at all. And this is something we all need to remember even for today, that when you do these things, it doesn't do you any good to do them halfway. You have to commit and then stick with the commitment. Next slide. Now, one of the things to remember is that when he made that commitment, we had one man suborbital flight that lasted 15 minutes, 28 seconds. We hadn't even put an American in orbit yet when he made that commitment. Next slide. This is from Race to the Moon, Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox, and to me it captures Apollo to the T. It was not a spacecraft. It was not an engineering challenge. It was a bet pushed to the middle of the table with the Soviets that we could beat you there. But in many ways it was a bet. It was like being in a poker game. It was like pulling a bluff, because at that point nobody had a clue we could get this done at all. So next slide. So how did we do this? How did we go from one 15-minute suborbital flight to guys walking on the moon in less than 9 years? Next slide. This is one of those things that probably everybody who's ever studied this will have their favorite top 10. These are my top 7, one of which I will not talk about. I am not intending this to be a large historical treatise backed up with memos and facts, but this is my view of how we did this. National will, money, heavy lift launch vehicles, landers, spacesuits, ops practices, and never discount luck. Okay, we were very lucky during Apollo. The only crew we lost, the Apollo 1 crew, basically taught us what was wrong with the command module before we ever got it into orbit. Now when we look back on that particular event, it's hard to imagine that nobody noticed that that was a disaster waiting to happen. But once we got those fixed, everything we did either worked perfectly or had enough backup in the systems that we never lost another crew. It was close on Apollo 13, but the bottom line was Apollo 1 taught us, in effect, how to get the crew back on Apollo 13. This was actually said by Kennedy at Rice Stadium, This was about 16 months after his commitment. And it's interesting because at that point, 16 months later, we already knew we were going to be building a big rocket. We already knew how we were going to do it at some level, and we knew it to such a degree that it had already filtered up into the White House. So, 16 months later, we already knew we needed a Saturn V. We already knew how fast we were going to be coming back into the atmosphere, things like that. So it shows a remarkable speed at which this project was tackled once the commitment was made. Next slide. Let's talk about these in turn. National will. The folks that did Apollo were the folks that won World War II. Just that simple. They were used to marshaling not only tremendous economic capability, but just damn initiative, hard work, and these were the people that said, okay, we're going to do this. It's hard to know, and it's interesting to speculate what might have happened if the Russians, the Soviets, had not launched Sputnik and not launched Yuri Gagarin before we did. My suspicion is if we had been on the moon by now, it would have been on an entirely different time scale. The fact was, though, that glove was thrown down and we picked it up. The country felt that Apollo was a commitment just like a war, and a good example of this is if you talk to some of these guys that were in Apollo, even though the Vietnam War was going on, they were deferred from the draft because it was felt that this was sufficiently important national program that they were not going to be drafted in the military. Money. Apollo program had lots of money. When Kennedy made his commitment, NASA had a budget of less than $1 billion, and Apollo only received about $100 million. At the peak of spending, NASA received $4.5 billion. Apollo received $2.9 billion. It was about 4% of the federal budget. I suspect that's somewhere around $100 million today. Imagine what we would do with $100 million. In fact, I'm glad sometimes we don't have that much money. Carrying the Fire, Mike Collins, probably the best book ever written by one of the Apollo guys, said the nice thing about Apollo was nobody ever told us we were running the costs up too high. You got enough money, you can do just about anything. Next slide. Heavy lift launch vehicles. We could not have gone to the moon without Saturn V. Saturn V is still the largest rocket mankind has ever launched. The Russians tried to do it. It's unfortunately they did not succeed, but the Saturn V is essentially still the biggest honking rocket that we've ever put into orbit. To give you an idea how big it was and how much it put into orbit, this was, the first flight was in 1967, so 5 years after we were flying guys in Mercury Atlases, we put effectively a whole Mercury Atlas, fully loaded, everything on orbit. Okay, this S-4B, when it got to orbit, was as heavy as the entire vehicle that launched the Mercury guys into orbit. That's a tremendous achievement. It's just impossible. We could not have done this. Okay, you could presumably say, well, we could have done the Saturn 1B. That would have meant multiple launches. That would have meant on-orbit assembly. Cryos, all the problems we're facing now with just 2 launches, things that we've learned to do now from space station, but we simply would not have been able to do in the 1960s. So again, we probably never would have made it by 1969. We also had to develop the infrastructure. We had to build the VAB. We had to build the crawlerway. We had to build Pad 39A. We had to build the launch tower, all the stuff, and we're still using that stuff. So that wasn't just a one-shot expense. That was an investment which we have continued to use and we will continue to use into this century. Now, this is a great picture from Apollo 13 rollout, and just an exquisite picture. It's unfortunate you can't quite see how good it is, but when I was looking at this, next slide, I just sort of had high res and I was kind of looking at it. The next slide. I'm looking up at here. Now go to the next slide. There are 3 guys standing on the top crane as that thing rolled out of the VAB sometime very early in the morning, and I think it would have been like February or March of 1970. That must have been a heck of a ride to think about when you finished your career. Next slide. Plus, do you think they'd let us do that anymore? Landers. Okay, there's been a lot written and discussed about the whole decision to go lunar orbit rendezvous. I'm not going to go into that. It was an interesting discussion, and it was clearly the right answer, again, to get us to the moon by the end of the decade. There was a lot of people, even after we made that decision, that didn't believe that was the right answer. And in some ways, the people that were the naysayers were correct. Jerome Weissner, who was I believe he had been the president of MIT and he was JFK's science advisor, argued vociferously against it. And at the time, he was looked at as sort of somebody who didn't really know what was going on. But if you look back at the sense of his arguments, what he said was correct. If you go lunar orbit rendezvous, you don't get much mass to the surface, and you'll never be able to turn this into an affordable, extensible mission. It'll be to the moon and back, and he proved somewhat prophetic, is that the LOR, while it got us to the moon before the end of the decade, and other ways probably would not have gotten us to the moon before the end of the decade, in some ways didn't allow us to extend beyond Apollo to what we're trying to do now with Constellation. The other interesting thing, well, first they said, well, we're going to do this. Well, now you have to build a lander, and nobody had ever done that before. The lander was the first true spacecraft. It had no thermal protection system to get the crew back if something didn't work right. There's a great quote by Dave Scott on the Apollo 9 press conference that said, the LEM is a spacecraft that cannot get back to the Earth's surface safely. It can get back, but we won't be in one piece when it does. So they had to get back, and this was the LEM on Apollo 9, which was the Earth orbit checkout. The interesting thing about the LEM is the LEM that flew on Apollo 11 was not the same configuration as the LEM that flew on Apollo 17. Apollo 17 came down with 2 guys, spacesuits, backpacks, and enough consumables for about a day on the lunar surface and a very small science package. By the time we got to Apollo 17, we were bringing just about everything but the kitchen sink and keeping it there for 3 days. That was all because we had both the ops practices, which we'll get there, but also that Grumman built into the LEM design enough margin that once we had proved we could land on the moon, then you could start doing more than just landing on the moon. And if they hadn't built that margin into the system, we would have never got there from here. Next one. EVA Systems. Any of you, if you want to read an absolutely terrifying discussion of what it was like in Gemini, go to Gene Cernan's book, The Last Man on the Moon, and read about his Gemini 9 EVA. He got outside. He couldn't move in the suit. The position that Ed White is in this picture is not because that's the way Ed White wants to be. That's because that's what the pressure garment does to you if it doesn't have mobility elements in it. And I've experienced that in pressure garments, and it's a lot of fun, believe me. When Cernan, by virtue of the fact that he had a hard time grabbing things and moving around, by the time he got back to the service module section of the Gemini, he could not see out of his helmet because he had fogged it all up. He had very high heart rates, very high metabolic rates. He actually had to stick his nose forward with and wipe a spot in the helmet so he could see out of it. At that point, they decided, after he'd gotten all the way back there, oh, we're going to quit this EVA. So they needed to turn around and get back all the way back to the command module. Then when he got in, he found out that he couldn't make the suit bend sufficiently to get in and get the hatch closed. So they basically had to cram the hatch down on top of it and fold him into a position that was excruciating in order to get the pressure back up so they could get out of the suit. 6 years later, Gene Cernan this time went on EVA on the lunar surface for 3 successive EVAs, over 21 hours of EVA, nary a qualm, nary a problem. If we had tried to do the moon with this suit instead of this suit, we would have never made it. So in really about 3 years, we went from a marginally workable EVA system to something that by Apollo 17, crews were doing routinely EVAs every day on the lunar surface for as long as 7.5 to 8 hours. There were some, glove problems, but the bottom line is they did the mission without any big problems. We did this, again, a lot of hard work and guts, but we built over a dozen different brand new spacesuits. Okay, if somebody had an idea, they built a suit and then built mods for that and mods for that. So there's probably 30 different spacesuits, maybe a dozen different primary and 30 different mods. How many spacesuits have we built since 1981? 0. Okay, and we built the shuttle suit, and that's it. So part of this isn't to say we should be building more spacesuits, but that's how they learn to do EVA, by constantly building things and trying them out and figuring out what worked and what didn't. Interestingly, if you go back in the budget, there isn't even a line for EVA Systems that shows that at least in the higher course of things, nobody was even keeping track of that money. Next slide. Operations practices. Everybody knows their names, Kranz, Chris Kraft, et cetera, et cetera. These guys started this profession, okay? Before Mercury, nobody knew how to control a space flight because nobody had ever done one. They built up everything we now have. This is one of my favorite pictures during Apollo 13, shortly after the tank blew up, with everybody trying to figure out what's going on. The flight director down here, but everybody helping him out. This was something that was put together strictly out of the heads of guys like Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz and Harrison Storms. We tend to think of it as a somewhat rigid system, but in fact it wasn't. It was very flexible. The flexibility is what got us back on Apollo 13. But there's another area that nobody really knows about or hasn't made much about, which enabled us to go again from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17. On Apollo 11, everybody knows you get down to the lunar surface. You burn down to a periapsis close to the moon, and then you fire up your engine again and then land just in a sense like you were doing it with a helicopter. On Apollo 11 and 12, that initial burn was done by the Descent Propulsion System engine, the DIPS, on the LEM. So one burn, okay, now you've used a bunch of fuel. You get down to periapsis, now you fire up the engine again and you descend to the lunar surface. That second burn has to be within the constraints of the fuel that you have left over from doing the first burn. So obviously you have less gas there to use. From Apollo 14 onward, once they understood the margins in the service propulsion system on the command service module stack, the CSM would do the burn down to the descent, or excuse me, the power descent insertion, the PDI point, which is your high gate as you go down. So the first time you fired up the LEM engine was when you started down to the lunar surface. So now you're starting off going down to the surface with a full tank of gas. Now, we'll look a little bit later about how much time they had on every mission, and they all had about the same amount of time left, regardless of whether it was 11, 12, or all the way out to 17. The difference was on the later missions, they had much more cargo down to the surface. They had consumables, all the things that allowed them to stay to 3 days, and we would never have gotten there if everybody, Mission Planning Analysis Directorate, MOD, everybody had said, how can we make this system work better? And that's how they did it. So, next. All right, enough my viewpoint. What did we actually do when we got there? So let's talk about that. Well, first is, these are the places we went, mostly equatorial, because that was within the design of the command service module engine and our ability to change planes and things like that. I'm not a dynamicist, so I can't give you all the details on that. The early ones were right on the equator, but you notice as we went later in the mission, again, understanding margins within the system allowed us to expand that horizon that we went down to the surface a bit. But we still were never able to get, for instance, at the poles or down to some really interesting places like Tycho or Aristarchus. These followed on the heels of all these missions. And if you go back and look at the progression of missions, it's really quite beautiful. Apollo 1, of course, we lost, but that would have been very similar to Apollo 7. Apollos 2 through 6 were unmanned flights testing various pieces of hardware, the LEM, the Saturn V, et cetera, et cetera. Apollo 7, we took the command service module, the LEO, and checked it out there. Apollo 8 was supposed to be Apollo 9, but the LEM wasn't ready, so in an interesting juxtaposition, a bunch of guys got together here at JSC in, I think it was September of 1968, and said, well, we don't want to redo Apollo 7. Why don't we do something else? So they got in the airplane literally at noon and flew to Marshall and sat down with von Braun and said, we want to go to the moon on Apollo 8. What do you think? He thought it over. They argued back and forth, and he said, sounds good. So then they got in the plane and they flew to Washington and sat down with George Mueller at the end of the day, that same day, and then met back again that morning, and then within 24 hours they decided to send Apollo 8 to the moon. So Apollo 8, because the LEM again wasn't ready, did the first orbital mission. I have heard from people that if you ever wanted to be at a splashdown party, it was Apollo 8. Apollo 11 wasn't so big as Apollo 8 because Apollo 8, when that got back, they knew they could do it. They figured everything else was straightforward. I've been told that the party went on for 3 days. NASA Road 1 was blocked. Contractors were giving away cases of hard liquor. People would sit by the pool out at the hotels over here, drink a case, go to sleep, wake up, go back. It went on for 3 days. None of us are born in time, I think, you know. So, Apollo 9 then took the LEM into low Earth orbit and checked it out, and also tested the spacesuit and the portable life support system. Apollo 10 then went to the moon and went down to where you would have initiated the burn to land, checking out all of the nav, and only on Apollo 11, when they had all those pieces all lined up, did they say, let's try and put it down on the ground. Very impressive set of missions. Next slide. I won't go through this. You can look it up, but I knew if I didn't put the cruise names, I'd get grief. So here are the cruise names. Next slide. Apollo 11 was actually the last engineering flight. All right. Apollo 11 was, the goal of the Apollo 11 crew was to get down and get back in one piece. If they got something done on the surface, that was great. But it was to get down, get back in one piece. July 1969. The only thing notable, there's two things that are notable here. One is that they landed almost 7 kilometers from the center of their ellipse, which happened, and I'll talk a little bit about why that happened. The other thing is when they landed, they say they actually had 45 seconds of hover time. I've actually heard it as low as 18 seconds. So it was a real cliffhanger, and frankly, probably no other pilot could have pulled that off other than Neil Armstrong. Only one EVA, just for 2 hours and 31 minutes, but in the course of that, they managed to do some good stuff. Next slide. They had 4 big problems. The first was they saturated the computer. So they're coming in on their powered descent, and the computer starts firing alarms at them. And luckily, because they had actually seen that on the last joint integrated sim, and Steve Bales, who was the computer guy, had gotten together with Draper Labs and figured out what they were. He understood what was going on. Everybody else had a heart attack, but he was the one that said, ignore him, go, you're still good. A number of navigational errors led them to be in the extent of being long, and they had things like state vector errors and uncoupled thrusting and all that jazz that all tended to, that added up and got them 7 kilometers long on their ellipse. As they approached the descent landing point, the designated landing point, it was clear they were headed into a boulder field. Now, I actually like Armstrong's comment here. He actually tried to land short because he felt if he could get up to the boulders, it would have more scientific value. That's very impressive because it meant he wasn't just flying the vehicle, he was thinking about what he might be able to do. But it was pretty clear he could not do that, so he flew downrange and landed at a safer spot. How many people have seen the Discovery Channel Apollo 11, The Real Story? All right, there's a really bad graphic in there that shows the LEM going, flying in and out of boulders. You know, well, it didn't happen that way. If you go on the Lunar Surface Journal, it's just like anybody who's a pilot knows. You roll on final. Oh, I'm a little low. Power goes up. You flatten your descent rate until you know you got the runway made, pull power down, and everything goes in. So you can actually see the LEM speed up past these boulders. And then it was not quite as scary as it sounds, but it was probably just about enough. So, and then as they got down to 30 meters, they realized that the ground was starting to disappear as they started picking up dust. But the interesting thing was, like I said, it's a little bit like landing an airplane in a thin fog. You can see the ground underneath it, but you can see all the stuff in the way, and they could see individual rocks picking up. So he just said, put it down. If you ever want to read just some interesting stuff, go into literature and read the crew debriefs, because they're really quite magnificent to see how they describe this. So next slide. The results and lessons learned, because they landed so long, they figured out that from the time the LEM undocks until they turn that engine on, they can't do anything because that screws up their hack on their trajectory. And there's a memo in the records from Bill Tinball, who was the head of Mission Planning and Analysis Directorate for Apollo 12, that said, look, guys, you can't even do a urine dump after you undock. You can't move around the cabin. You just sit there until you start that down, and you'll get there. We discovered that the lunar surface was covered with this layer of loose ground-up stuff, which we call sometimes regolith, sometimes soil, sometimes dirt. It was below 10 centimeters, it was really well compacted. Above 10 centimeters, it was really fluffy like loose snow. We didn't really expect that. Some people probably did, but not generally. It would tend to be a bane and a boon. Operationally, it was a pain, but we got some of our best lunar samples out of sampling that soil. This is one of my favorite things. They picked up a bunch of rocks. Armstrong looked at the one rock box and realized that the rocks didn't always completely fill the box, so there was entry space. So he took a shovel and just filled the thing completely up with dirt. That was one of the best soil samples we ever had. It wasn't on the list of things to do. He took his initiative, and we got some of the most important samples we've ever had out of that soil sample, which became 10005. And largely on his initiative, they walked to the edge of this crater. And the interesting thing about this crater is you can see bedrock, broken up bedrock in the base of the crater, which says that the megalith is about 5 meters thick at that point. He never told anybody he was doing that, or they would have said, no, you can't do that. Because, who knows, the boogeyman might be hiding in the crater. So anyhow, so even though it was a basic engineering mission, they got a lot done science-wise, and they set the stage for missions that were involved. Next slide. Apollo 12 was the first step toward doing real science on this. They brought the Lunar Science Experiment Package, the ALSEP, which they didn't bring on Apollo 11 because they wanted to give them as much fuel as possible. Having landed somewhere in Apollo 11, they decided they really needed to get precise, so they wanted to try and do something really precise. They knew that the Surveyor 3 had landed in Oceanus Procellarum in 1967, so the decision was made, let's see if we can land close enough to walk up to it and take pieces off and bring it back, which is quite a challenge, particularly after Apollo 11 landed so long, but Conrad decided he was up to it. They had 103 seconds of fuel left, and they landed 13 meters from their touchdown point. Pretty darn good. And that was just the second mission. Next slide. They got down to the Surveyor. This was the first crew that really started seeing what a pain dirt would be. So you can see that and we don't know who this is because this was before we started putting stripes on different people's suits so we could identify who was who in a picture. My suspicion is this is probably Pete Conrad, but you can already see he's got dirt from the knees down. This is the second EVA, and you can see how close the LEM is. And this was not taken with a telephoto. It was taken with a normal lens, so it was just several hundred meters away. Precision landing. We brought back the Surveyor 3 parts, which are now in the Smithsonian. Actually, interestingly, folks from other NASA centers have now gotten them back from the Smithsonian, and are looking at them to start to really quantify with, 21st century techniques what actually we found on those cameras and parts. The ALSEP packages proved their worth, although their deployment was time-consuming. It took up a whole EVA. They walked in excess of 2 kilometers, but they were often in very low sun angles, less than 10 degrees. This was the lowest sun angle we had on any Apollo mission, and sometimes it was pretty exciting to walk around and then walk into a hole because you didn't see the hole because it was bright and it was dark. And anybody who's ever skied on rough terrain in bright sunlight has probably had the experience of finding out that the snow wasn't exactly where you thought it was supposed to be, and that's the same thing they had. They brought a different set of suite of samples back. They also saw some interesting features on the surface that they really never had time to do much about, except take pictures and say, these are pretty cool. And it started to indicate that we were going to have, in a sense, a problem with this, that there was always more to do, more to see than you had time to do. And that's what it means to go to a neat place. The one other thing about this Surveyor 3 is, up to this point, there was a guy by the name of Thomas Gold, who was an eminent scientist, I say that with quotes, who maintained that the moon was covered with this big layer of dust. The crew had disappeared and never be seen again, and all that stuff, and dust was floating around, and it would cover everything and stuff like that. Does some of this sound a little familiar to what we're hearing now? Well, the bottom line is they came to the Surveyor, and the only dirt that was on it was dirt that had been blown onto it as the LEM flew by overhead, proving that dirt does not drift aimlessly about in the lunar atmosphere. Next slide. Apollo 14. Apollo 14 was really the first mission that we had a physically challenging, topographically challenging landing site. We were landing in rough terrain in something called the Fra Mauro Formation, which is believed to be ejecta from the Imbrium Basin event. They were going to do 2 EVAs, and they wanted to go farther than Apollo 12, but they hadn't gotten the rover ready yet. So they built something, they put together something called the Modularized Equipment Transporter, the MET, and it was dubbed Shepherd's Rickshaw, that they would take along on what would ultimately become the most physically challenging EVA we did any time on Apollo. They were supposed to walk from the landing site up to Cone Crater which was a young crater about the size of Meteor Crater in Arizona, fairly big crater, and which was assumed it had punched through the Fromora Formation and would give us a stratigraphy, a vertical understanding of the different rock types on that as we walked up the ejecta blanket. It was also overlain by material which appeared to be an array of Copernicus crater, which is another young, very young crater, and so we wanted to get pieces of that. February 71, they landed within 18 meters of their planned touchdown point, 68 seconds of fuel left, not too bad. 2 guys on the surface again, 2 hours, 2 EVAs, and about 9 hours of EVA time. Next slide. Apollo 14 had a lot of serious challenges, and it ended up compromising science badly. One is, to say they got lost isn't entirely true, but they found that when you walk any significant distance away from the LEM, you don't have any idea how far the next thing is. You don't have anything to judge distance. A crater that you think is this big may turn out to be this big or bigger because there's no haze. There's nothing that you can use your sort of standard sense we all use to judge distance and time and stuff like this. They really, in a sense, did get lost because the topography turned out to be rolling hills, some cases slopes as steep as 15 degrees, heavily covered with regolith. They'd climb up what they thought was the edge of Cone Crater, get to the top, and there'd be another ridge. They'd climb up that ridge. There'd be another ridge. And they were so disoriented that they actually walked past Cone Crater, and they finally decided, by definition, this is Cone Crater. We're going to sample here and go back, because they were completely winded. The modular equipment transporter proved to be a pain to work with. As John pointed out, it became the best sled we ever took to the moon. The problem is lunar dirt is not like snow, so they ended up having to pick it up and carry it, which must be a little bit like doing a 3-legged race carrying a shopping cart. I can't imagine how they ever did that, and if I were them, I probably would have left it. So it was a real pain. They generally did a good job on the ALSEP. They did a good job on the ALSEP, but a lot of things didn't work. We had a geophone line where Ed Mitchell was supposed to be firing a thumper, which only worked about 1 every 3 times, so it took him longer to do stuff than we expected, and there was really no way of fixing that, so we didn't get as much data back on, not the crew's fault. Next line. Okay, we go to the J missions. Now, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H are designations for earlier missions that somewhere I couldn't find it for this mission, for this talk, but the J missions ended up being the extended Apollo missions. They had the rover, they had 3 days on the lunar surface, and they became the premier science exploration of the whole Apollo program, and certainly of the, in my opinion, of the space program. The experience we got from 11, 12, and 14 allowed us to go to really exciting areas to land in. We understood that the margins on the command service modules, so as I said earlier, we could have the CSM do the burn down to descent orbit, or excuse me, powered descent. So you had extra fuel to bring more mass to the surface. They went to the moon with enough consumables for 3 days. The lunar roving vehicle, an improved pressure garment that enhanced mobility, among other things that allowed you to sit down. The A7LB or A7L, you could sort of do this, but you couldn't really bend at the waist. On one mission, they actually brought a telescope. On Apollo 16, they brought a telescope, so you had a lot of science they could bring down to the surface. It also started to drive the understanding of what we would be allowed to do and what we wouldn't allowed to do. This is a quote from Gene Cernan. I won't read it all the way through, but the basics of it is, if we listened to the guys that were really conservative, they'd only let us walk 1 kilometer or 2 from the LEM, and then what's the point of bringing a rover? We decided that we could accept either a rover failure, so if we were within walk-back distance, it wasn't a problem, or we could accept a PLIS failure, in which case we'd ride back while one guy's PLIS supported the other guy's PLIS, but that saying we have to guard against both failures was not acceptable, and a far out, it was too far out to consider. What that essentially means is if we had run into that way out the 9th decimal place off to the right and lost a PLIS and lost the rover, we would have lost a crew member, because there was not enough consumables in one crew member's PLIS to allow them to walk back 10 kilometers. So they were willing to go out on a limb with credible failures in order to get some exploration done. Next slide. 15, landed on a Mare surface between the Apennine Mountains and the edge of Hadley Rill. They wanted to sample the mountains because it was expected that those were fault blocks uplifted when the Imbrium Basin was excavated. They wanted to go to the rill because there's a lot of these things on the moon, and some of them look like they're river valleys, and we couldn't figure out what they were. They also had an enhanced ALSEP array that included a heat flow experiment, which would require drilling holes into the surface, so we had to bring down a drill. Landed July of 71, again, 549 meters northwest, still 100 seconds left, 3 EVAs, total of 18 hours and 35 minutes EVA time. There's an interesting quote from John Young, no, excuse me, it's Gene Cernan on Apollo 17, but basically says once you have a rover, hitting your landing spot on the beam becomes less of an issue because you don't have to worry about walking long distances. You can hop on the rover and drive. So you'll start to see the fact that these numbers start to get large again, but it's basically because when they did pitch over, they decided, that looks like a better spot to land than the one they thought we wanted us to land. Let's go there. Next slide. Apollo 15 was great. They just did all sorts of stuff. It was also exciting because this was a pair of crew members that were absolutely fired up about doing the science. And if you go back and listen to the transcripts, they're obviously having a ball out there. It's not a drudge, it's not a pain. They're just enjoying themselves on the lunar surface. The LRV proved its worth. It took crews up slopes in excess of 20 degrees, distances well in excess of the 2 kilometers. Sometimes they were on slopes so steep that when they got out of the rover, it started to slide back downhill. And they had to find a crater literally to put it into to keep. So they were going up really steep slopes. They found, among other things, something called the Genesis rock, which is still the most pristine piece of lunar crust I think we've ever found. The LRVs were great. They did show some issues. The rear steering failed, so they had to sort of work around that. The fenders on the rest of the missions proved highly problematical. If you looked at them the wrong way, they fell off. And they didn't fix them on this one, so they ended up getting really dirty. The drill proved to be a real pain in the neck. In fact, we ended up, 2 real big things happened. One is we ended up not doing half of an EVA, and some of us feel that the thing we missed on the second half of the EVA, of third EVA, is really disappointing because it took an extra half of an EVA to get the damn thing out of the ground. The other thing is it proved so hard getting out of the ground that Jim Irwin actually, we found out later, had a small heart attack on the lunar surface. He was exerting himself, so he actually went into a period of significant arrhythmia. And he was in great shape, so it wasn't a big issue, but it proved to be a real pain. The timeline and ground supervision proved at times to be somewhat irritating to the crew. There's at least one case where they were driving from point A to point B. They saw a rock they hadn't seen before. So Dave Scott said, "Jim, I think your seatbelt's loose." He stopped the vehicle, and while Jim was, quote, fixing the seatbelt, Dave ran over, whacked off a piece of the rock, brought it back, and off they went. That ended up being called the seatbelt basalt. But they did it totally, they faked out the guys on the ground, and they didn't even tell them about it till they got home. Sometimes they would do things that were perhaps inappropriate because they had they were in certain places where they were told, do this, and they say, we don't really think we should, no, do it. So they would do things like break samples when they were surrounded by bedrock, and they should have been looking through the bedrock. So next slide. 16. Apollo 16 landed at Descartes, Central Nearside Highlands, the only pure Highlands mission. Exciting. We had very bad photography. We didn't know that, for instance, rocks the size of Building 1 weren't hiding at the Apollo 16 landing site. And the first time we found out was when John pitched over and said, "Oh, doesn't look too bad." But we had no idea that those were or were not there. The site geology turned out to be completely different from what the crew had been led to expect. This is a real testament to the quality of their geologic training, because they got on the ground and they said, "We ain't seeing what you told us was be here." And everybody said, "No, you must be seeing what no, it ain't there." And they ended up basically improvising and brought back a tremendous suite of samples, but it was totally different. And until they got back, everybody said, "Gee, those don't look like anything like we expected you to sign." So, next slide. Like I said, best part of scientific reasoning, we reached the wrong conclusions for the right reasons. The crew recognized it and just went ahead and did their job as good scientists would. We showed that the highlands are a mess geologically, and we're still trying to unravel that. It showed the value of detailed, extensive training for the crew before flight. How many people are in here from MOD training? Anybody? Okay, now I'm not going to shoot at you. The crew had over 1,000 hours of geologic training before they flew to that site, including one field trip that was 3 weeks before the launch. 1,000 hours out in the field doing geology. And it paid off. It turned out to be not as bad a place, but a lot of young impact craters have huge boulder fields around them that we wouldn't have been able to drive through. So that was somewhat exciting, and the craters proved out to be somewhat steeper than expected. The heat flow cable. John Young is putting in the heat flow cable. During training, he had told them, this is a trip hazard, this is a catch hazard, I'm going to have problems with this. And sure enough, on the moon, he backed up, pulled the heat flow cable out, and the heat flow probe was at that point dead, and that experiment was failed. And it shows the point. And John, by the way, if you ever talk to John, do not say, hey, how about that heat flow probe cable, John, because he'll smack you, because he's still sensitive about that. It shows that if a crew member is telling you something isn't working, listen to him. When they did the same experiment on Apollo 17, by that time, they'd welded the things on with, like, titanium, so then it didn't fail on Apollo 17. They were also late landing by about 2 orbits because of command service module problems, which meant they had to totally replan, which the back room here did a great job of, and they pulled a good mission out of it. So, next slide. Apollo 17, the last landing, landed in the Taurus Littrow Valley, extending out to the east of Mare Serenitatis. The first geologist to fly in space, currently in some level, well, not the only geologist, first geologist to fly to the moon. Was an interesting crew dynamic. When they were landing, Schmidt was clearly the co-pilot. When they got on the ground and started working, Cernan dutifully and gladly assumed the role of second to the geologist, and the interaction between those guys was wonderful, and it resulted in the highest science return that we got. They drove up the steepest slopes, 26 degrees to this thing. If you look off to the side here, that's a panorama. That's the slope they drove up. And somewhere way the heck out here is the limb. Next slide. Best science we got, the presence of a trained geologist working in conjunction with a highly trained and observant test pilot proved to be a great combination. And it's the sort of thing we're going to need to be able to do on Constellation. They had a great landing site. They had access to bedrock units because of boulders that rolled down, and they could see where they came from. They found an unprecedented surprise, orange dirt at Station 4. And they used a number of things like the LRV soil sampler, which was nicknamed the Pooper Scooper, which allowed Jack to just scoop up a soil sample on the LRV en route and provided some very good serial samples across the valley. Apollo 15, as in Apollo 15, the LRV fender failed, but this time they fixed it with orbital maps and clamps from the LEM, and by God, that worked. Oh, plus the duct tape. Got to have duct tape in there. So it was such an interesting site that they went over their timeline in certain places, and they didn't have enough time at other places that turned out to even be more interesting. And it showed that when you really get going on this stuff, it's really hard to package this thing into a timeline. Next slide. Okay, we're almost done. I'm almost on time. How about that? John, do we have is a meeting after this?
Not right at 1.
Okay. Good, I can keep you for hours more. Now, I will run through these, but these are my top 6 or so of why Apollo matters. Before Apollo, we thought the moon was a big dust ball. Actually, it was assumed to be a chondritic, a big honking chondritic meteorite. We didn't know what the craters were. We didn't know that the Maria were lava flows, all this stuff. We absolutely did not know nothing about the moon. And the idea is that what we thought we knew about the moon largely turned out to be wrong. It proved that the moon was a very active body in its early solar system history. There was a huge amount going on. At some point, the moon, if you've been to any of these things, you learned that the outer crust of the moon, probably down to at least 100 or 200 kilometers, was completely melted, the whole thing. And it was part of the Earth-Moon system, which means we went through the same thing at the same time. So it totally opened up our understanding of what early solar system history was, which was completely unknown. There's some physicists out there that say that we didn't learn anything important on the moon. NASA doesn't learn any good science stuff. They're completely wrong. You know, Apollo set the stage for everything we know about the solar system now, and all of the things we're looking at in extrasolar planetary systems is based on our understanding from Apollo. Next slide. How we could build robust spacecraft. You know, the Apollo 17 LEM had no discrepancies for the entire mission. Kind of makes you wish we'd done more. But nothing went wrong on it. And like I said, we started out with 2 hours or 22 hours on the surface, 2 hours EVA, going to 72 hours on the surface, and 22 hours, 23 hours of EVA on the surface. Tremendous. Next slide. How to do ops. You know, Kraft and Kranz and Harrison Storms invented this stuff. It was based upon previous experience, but they made it up as they went. So they had engineering experience. All of them were former military guys. And they were just really smart people and just did the right things. And we're still using it, but it particularly shone through when we did Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. This is another one of my favorite Apollo 13 pictures. So, next. How to build BHLBs, big honking launch boosters. Apollo 17 liftoff. This is just, that was the Mercury Atlas. We took the Mercury Atlas to low Earth orbit in less than 6 years. Amazing. Next slide. What we learned, how to do this, okay? How to do planetary surface exploration. This is one of my favorite pictures of the Apollo 17 landing site. Look at the mountains in back there. Now, it's a telephoto shot, but just look at that terrain they landed on. It's just stunning. And we learned it all on Apollo, and we will be applying those lessons to everything we do on Constellation. So, next slide. Lessons learned for Constellation. Planetary geology is not a function of time. It's a function of observation, revisits as appropriate. How to sample, how big, how small, how to handle the samples. When to tell the ground that we're busy now, go away. Things break, okay? Things break. Anybody that doesn't, I really want everybody to say things break, okay? You need to be able to understand how to fix them, even if it is with duct tape and aerophotos. When a crew member says, I think that's going to break, listen to them, because it probably is. There's never enough time to see everything, so you got to start with a plan and try to stick with it. But every once in a while you find out something really cool, and that point the plan goes out the window. The surface crew has the best judgment on the tasks better than the ground. So the ground has to be willing to accept the fact that the crew understands this better than they do. We need navigational capability on the ground. We solved this a little bit with the LRV because we had inertial nav on the LRV, which could get you back from essentially anywhere you're driving it to within about half a kilometer. The assumption being if you're within half a kilometer on a Mare surface, you could figure out where to go from there. But, the Apollo 14 walking traverses showed you could potentially have walked past the LEM if it was on the other side of a small ridge and never know it, because everything looks the same. And anybody who's ever been out in the woods much knows that every once in a while you don't exactly get lost, but you are damn confused for a short period of time. So we need the proper tools and procedures for the right situation. Scale and nature, the problem dictate the solution. Get the crew the tools, let them do their job. Maximize the crew flexibility. Again, Apollo 17 is the perfect example of what we're going to do on Constellation. We had a pilot, a very good pilot who was a test pilot who was trained to be an observer as a test pilot, and all we did was take his observing skills and turn them onto another focus, working with a trained geologist who knew how to fly well enough to act as that test pilot's co-pilot until they got to the surface. Automate the science station deploys as much as possible, but please put something in there in case it doesn't work, because you'd be really dumb if you push the easy button, as Jack Schmidt likes to say, and it just went, Automate as much as possible, because it's a big waste of crew members' time to put them on the surface and then have them screwing connectors in and digging holes. If you can get around having people do it, but make sure you have it available. Keep your eyes open for unexpectedly useful things. Things like the LRV sample, the rake tool, and using a 500 millimeter Hasselblad were not originally in the program. They were things that either crew members or geologists said, you know, this would really help. And the system and the program was up to figuring out how to do that, building it, and getting it ready to fly in a very short period of time. And then lastly, lunar dirt will be a pain, but it ain't pixie dust. There's nothing magical about it. If we look at how mine operators and quarry operators and other kinds of industrial situations that deal with silicate powders handle their problem and apply that, we'll be able to get to the bottom of this. Next slide. I will finish with this slide and make the point that we do not want Constellation to be a pile of chips pushed across the table. We want to be able to go back to the moon this time to stay. So we need to think of how to do that not as a flash in the pan, but that's something we built deliberately, that's extensible, and that we will be doing when I die, which hopefully is a long time from now. Last slide. I benefited greatly from conversations with Paul and John, also Kent Houston, Nancy Ann Budd, and Steve Hoffman, John Younghurst, blah, blah, blah. If I screwed up, it's my problem, not theirs. And I have a list of historical references that are all excellent. I have some of them up here if you want to come afterwards and look. They are my copies, so please don't take them, because a lot of these are out of print now. Any questions? Thank you. God, you bought it all, huh? Amazing.
We've read the books.
Yeah, I've read the books. Yeah.
You had a line saying that I think Apollo 12, the satellite less than 10 degrees above the horizon, and they're talking about a problem that we're going to have even worse conditions.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, the 12 crew reported that with a. The question was that the Apollo 12 lighting conditions were actually somewhat better than we will experience at the pole, and that is exactly correct. I'm looking forward to when we start getting LRO pictures back, because right now we don't have very many good pictures of the pole at a high resolution. But yeah, that's going to be an issue, and we haven't tackled that effectively yet. And I don't know the solution, but it will be something we have to worry about.
And we are talking about illumination. So you guys might have seen some of the videos of the Chariot driving around out there on the rock tower. Well, Chariot has little lights on the bottom of it to illuminate out in front. And EVA guys have lights on their helmets now. So people are talking about illumination to help us out in those polar regions. It won't be like Apollo.
Yeah.
How glare resistant was their?
It was pretty good, but it's really, I mean, the lunar surface, while it is relatively dark, it's like only 6 or 8% albedo, still pretty bright when you look down the sun, so there's a lot reflecting off, and it was pretty glary. If you look at some of the panoramas, and they went all around, when you start to look from directly, as they went down sun, pretty soon things wash out pretty good. This will actually be an issue also if we're doing operations in high noon and anything other than the poles, because when the sun is high in the sky, it's going to be like skiing and flat lighting, where you won't get a lot of visual cues as to what's there, so that's going to be tricky as well. So, any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the crew debriefs. To read the crew debriefs, where can we find them?
If you go to, the question was, where can we find the crew debriefs? These two websites, in particular the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. If you just go on the web, Google Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, it'll take you to this absolutely astonishingly wonderful source. And it was put together by a guy by the name of Eric Jones, who's a retired Los Alamos guy. And it's the best example of why the web is a different kind of resource than either books or videos, because it has, what Eric did was get the transcripts, surface transcripts, then he interviewed the crew members extensively and got their comments line for line. So you see somebody saying something, and then 20 years later you say, well, what I think I meant here, or this is what was happening. And then he's interleaved that with the photographs and the videos and the ancillary documents. He's PDF'd all of the documents, like all of the crew debriefs, all of the technical mission reports, all the technical debriefs. So they're on there as PDFs, and you can download them. There may be other places, but that's one I know.
That just covers the experience on the surface, or does that also cover the experiences?
The Apollo Flight Journal is something they're starting to put together, and that's actually, if you ever want to see what a Saturn V is like, you just go read any one of the 2-hour transcripts before they launch, and they have these amazing discussions of, well, the Saturn V is sitting here, and there's a little window on top of the launch escape tower that's lined up perfectly with this thing that and it was a Swiss watch. It was a 7 or 6 million pound Swiss watch. So yeah, that's in the Apollo Flight Journal, and they start to talk more about the flight dynamic situations as opposed to the surface. And I think they've got about 4 of the missions. They're slowly building that up. I think they've got 8, 10, 15, and 16 are in that, but they're going with the others eventually. Say again?
Is there a question on the web or just an open mic?
Oops. Any other questions? Okay, we are at 1 o'clock. I am on Global.
Yeah.
If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I will answer them to the best of my ability. Get some of these books. If you're really interested, they're good books. So, thank you.
See you back in 2 weeks to find out the kind of things we're talking about doing when we return to the moon based on what we learned from Apollo. So see you guys then.